Presentation 10, Part B, in the Evolution of Socialism, the American Progressives. As we learned in the last section, American progressivism has its roots firmly planted in European social democracy, which itself was an offshoot of Marxism. Insights into several prominent American progressives and their ideas. Charles Austin Beard was a historian and author. He completed his graduate studies at Oxford University in England in 1899 and received a Ph.D. in history from Columbia University in New York in 1904. He went on to become a professor at Columbia University. In order to help progressives break with the past in favor of a more egalitarian society, a body of scholarly work emerged that questioned the long-standing view that our founders were motivated by a sense of selfless duty to a country and a commitment to natural law as enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. It was Beard's essay, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, published in 1913, that contended that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia were motivated by personal economic concerns and determined to produce a document that strengthened their control and thus ensured their continued financial success. Theodore Roosevelt was the 26th President of the United States from 1901 to 1909. During this time, progressives were calling for a sharp increase in the scope of government power in order to remedy a whole new host of economic and social ills facing modern society. There may be no greater example of this phenomenon than Theodore Roosevelt's speech on the New Nationalism in 1910, which became the foundation for his 1912 campaign to regain the presidency. The New Nationalism speech reflects Roosevelt's turn after his presidency to progressivism and reflects the extent to which other progressives had come to influence his thinking. Roosevelt called for the state to take an active role affecting economic equality by way of superintending the use of private property. Private property rights, which had been serving as a brake on the more aggressive progressive policy proposals, were to be respected, Roosevelt argued, only insofar as the government approved of the property's social utility. In the speech, Roosevelt stated that we grudge no man a fortune in civil life if it is honorably obtained and well used. We should permit it to be gained only so long as the gaining represents benefit to the community. This, I know, implies a policy of far more active governmental interference with social and economic conditions in this country than we have had yet. But I think we have to face the fact that such an increase in governmental control is now necessary. New circumstances, Roosevelt argued, necessitated a new conception of government, and natural rights were no longer to serve as a principled boundary that the state was prohibited from crossing. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was the 28th President of the United States. A leading intellectual of the progressive era, he was educated at Princeton University and Johns Hopkins University. He served as president of Princeton from 1902 to 1910, and then as governor of New Jersey in 1911. With Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft dividing the Republican vote, Wilson was elected president as a Democrat in 1912 and again in 1916. The progressives understood that the Constitution was an obstacle in the way of their agenda, and they were critical of the notion that the fundamental purpose of government was to secure the individual natural rights of citizens. The regulatory and redistributive aims of the progressives were on a collision course with the political theory of the founding. Wilson wrote extensively on this. Wilson on the Declaration of Independence. The progressives understood that the Constitution was an obstacle in the way of their agenda. It is with this in mind that Wilson urged that we are not bound to adhere to the doctrines held by the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Wilson's 1887 essay on Socialism and Democracy. Wilson defined socialism as standing for unfettered state power, which trumps any notion of individual rights. He said that it proposes that any limitation of public authority by individual rights be put out of view, and that no line can be drawn between private and public affairs which the state may not cross at will. After laying out this definition of socialism, Wilson explained that he found nothing wrong with it in principle, since it was merely a logical extension of genuine democratic theory. It gives all the power to the people in their collective capacity to carry out their will through the exercise of governmental power, unlimited by any idea like individual rights. Wilson elaborated, in fundamental theory, socialism and democracy are almost, if not quite, one and the same. Common to both is the absolute right of the community to determine its own destiny and that of its members. According to Wilson, rights-based theories of self-government, such as the republicanism to which our American founders subscribed, are far less democratic than socialism. As Wilson and his fellow progressives believed, rights-based theories of government limit the state's sphere of action, thus limiting the ability of the people to implement their collective will. So as we've seen, American progressives, typified by Wilson's views, had a favorable view of collectivism and statism. It's the classic inverted pyramid of ruler's law described by Skousen, where all the power is in the collective or the state, with no power for the individual at the bottom. And it is incompatible with the building blocks of a free society. Our founders very purposely created a representative republic and not a direct democracy. They did so because throughout history, direct democracies have always failed. They result in the tyranny of the majority over the minority. They degenerate into mob rule. They are ultimately not a form of self-government compatible with a free society. Wilson on public administration. The extent of regulatory activity in which progressives wanted the national government to engage in required the establishment of a substantial bureaucratic apparatus, free from the influence of electoral politics. Progressive administration by quote-unquote educated experts was to engage not only in executive action, but also in legislative and judicial action as well. Wilson introduced the concept of separating administration from politics, which was influenced by the German school, in a series of essays in the 1880s, most notably The Study of Administration, which many public administration scholars consider to have marked the founding of their discipline in this country. Wilson's administrative state is also the same as ruler's law as described by Skousen, with the unelected bureaucracy at the top of the power pyramid and the individual at the bottom. Another influential American progressive was Frank Johnson Goodnow. He studied at Amherst College and the Columbia School of Law, after which he studied abroad in Paris and Berlin. He was a professor at Columbia University and was appointed to several presidential commissions and became the third president of Johns Hopkins University in 1914. In contrast to the principle of natural rights, Goodnow praised political systems in Europe, where he explained that rights which an individual possesses are conferred upon him not by his creator, but rather by the society to which he belongs. What they are is to be determined by the legislative authority in view of the needs of that society. Social expediency, rather than natural right, is thus to determine the sphere of individual freedom of action. In contrast to the beliefs of American progressives, a free society is not possible without protected individual rights. Only individuals can have rights, not governments or societies. Freedom is meaningless without equally protected rights. And a government that can sanction an individual's rights can also take them away. John Dewey was another influential American progressive. He was a philosopher, psychologist, and educational reformer who greatly influenced American progressivism in the areas of education and social reform. He was educated at the University of Vermont and Johns Hopkins University, and he went on to professorships at the University of Michigan, the University of Chicago, and Columbia University. In criticizing our founders and the Constitution, Dewey declared natural rights theory blinded the eyes of our founders, and our founders' ideas were relevant only to their own time. The history of liberalism, about which Dewey wrote in Liberalism and Social Action in 1935, was progressive. It told a story of a move from more primitive to more mature conceptions of liberty. Modern liberalism, he contended, represented a vast improvement over the classical liberalism of our founders. With regard to education, Dewey proclaimed, "I believe that education is a regulation of the process of coming to share in the social consciousness, and the adjustment of individual activity on the basis of this social consciousness is the only sure method of social reconstruction." Control the education of the young was a mandate of the progressives. This is illustrated by an article in the New Republic magazine, which was founded in 1914 by progressives Herbert Croly and Walter Lippmann. It quickly became an important organ of progressive opinion. In a 1916 article, it editorialized that unlike the 18th century liberalism of our founders, 20th century democracy believes that the community has certain positive ends to achieve. And if they're going to be achieved, the community must control the education of the young. The progressives set the stage for a post-constitutional America. They did so by establishing a criticism of our founding principles. They developed arguments to downplay individual rights. They advocated for the creation of a regulatory administrative state and the appointment of activist progressive judges to work around the constitutional limitations on government power. They advocated for a redistribution of wealth along with a host of other social programs. And they used collectivism as a justification and statism as a means of implementation. Many modern-day American politicians proudly proclaim that they are progressives. Key points for Section 10, Part B, on the American progressives. Progressivism can be thought of as an argument to progress or to move beyond the political principles of the American founding. The progressives argued that the limits placed on national government by the Constitution represented major obstacles to implementing their agenda. They sought ways to work around the Constitution. Progressives advocated controlling the education of the young as part of their method of social reconstruction.